In a recent interview, President-elect Donald Trump talked about increasing defense spending for NATO members.
I was able to get hundreds of billions of dollars put into NATO just by a tough attitude. I said to the countries, I'm not going to protect you unless you pay. And they started paying. And that amounted to more than $600 billion. If they're paying their bills, and if I think they're treating us fairly, the answer is absolutely. I'd stay with NATO.
The statement appears to have caused panic among Western European elites, with the Financial Times reporting that the pact is set to sharply increase its defence spending requirement from 2 to 3% of GDP at next year's NATO summit in The Hague. The call for a radical increase in NATO military funding was made by Polish President Andrzej Duda in March. NATO countries must take greater responsibility for the security of the alliance as a whole, intensively modernise and strengthen their militaries. Therefore, I believe that it is necessary to increase the level of defence spending from 2 to 3% of GDP by all countries in the alliance. I will work towards convincing our allies to do so. Today, the issue of defence spending by members of the alliance does not look bright, because although Germany, for example, is expected finally to spend about 2% of GDP on defence this year, the required level of spending will not be reached by 8 of the 32 NATO countries: Croatia, Portugal, Italy, Canada, Belgium, Luxembourg, Slovenia and Spain. The level of 3%, if achieved by all NATO countries, would indeed be a qualitative leap. Let's not forget that the expenditure of the European part of NATO is still incomparably lower than that of the United States. We often hear in Europe that individual countries don't spend as much as they should on armaments because they don't have the money. Well, this is not true. The countries of the European Union have a lot of money. They just spend it on useless things like ideological programs. Just last year, under the United Right government, Poland was a pace-setter in the pact, spending twice as much on defence as the 2% required by NATO. The problem is that this year's spending looks set to fall. There is a large amount of negligence or omissions related to the signing of contracts. We still don't know whether these important contracts will be implemented. The issue of 500 HIMARS rocket launchers for the Polish army is still relevant. The issue of acquiring more K2 tanks with their production in our country is still relevant. Recently, Deputy Defence Minister Paweł Bejda of the Polish People's Party announced that this year's spending from the Armed Forces Support Fund will reach just over 60% of the planned amount. This means that about 20 billion zloty less than planned will go to the Polish defence, and Polish military spending this year will be less than 4% of GDP. We asked about the issue of falling military spending in Parliament. What could this 20 billion be used for, if not for the military from the Armed Forces Support Fund? Well, it could go anywhere. I don't know what the government's plans are, but I think it will be used for many other purposes that are also useful. Interestingly, there seems to be conflicting reports from the current leadership of the Ministry of Defence about this year's defence spending from the Armed Forces Support Fund. This fund is working, it's doing great, and we're increasing it every time so that, as the president of Warsaw, Trzaskowski, said, in 2026 we can reach 5% of GDP defence spending. Mr. Minister, will defence spending reach 4% this year? This year, if I remember correctly, 4.3% is planned for defence. Lies are already coming out. On the one hand, the biggest budget hole in history, on the other hand, virtual money and creative accounting. Citizens' presidential candidate Dr. Karol Nawrocki met military officers and experts to discuss Polish defence issues. We will discuss security issues that will later become part of Karol Nawrocki's election campaign programme. Nawrocki called on his main rival, Rafał Trzaskowski, to recognise the priorities of Poland's security policy, including increasing the size of the army to 300,000 soldiers and to sign a document dubbed the Polish Security Constitution. This 4.2% of Polish GDP for the armed forces for the Polish army is, of course, as we know today, difficult to achieve, while in my opinion it is something that should happen. Dr. Karol Nawrocki has already emphasised that in the election campaign he wants to exclude security issues from the political dispute. I share President Donald Trump's efforts to strengthen NATO and mobilise other countries to build NATO with the strength of their own GDP. Under the leadership of Donald Tusk's so-called smiling government, Poland remains the leader in defence spending among NATO countries, despite the announced decrease in defence spending. The question is, for how long? Which is why the upcoming presidential elections are so important.